Gideon Marsh had lived his whole life in the rough silence of the backcountry. A man who knew pain the way most of us know weather, something you just endure. But this time, something was different. On his leg, just above the knee, a swelling had grown over weeks until it bulged to the size of a clenched fist. It throbbed day and night, the kind of pain that doesn't let you sleep, the kind that whispers there's something deeply wrong. And then one morning, it finally burst. But what spilled out wasn't blood, and it wasn't pus. It was something that should never come from a human body. A thick, yellowish fluid mixed with tiny fragments of metal. Pieces so small they caught the light like grains of silver sand. Imagine standing there, staring down at your own body and realizing you're leaking metal. What would you even think in that moment? Was he poisoned? Cursed? Or had something inside him been growing all along, waiting for the right time to tear its way out? I think about how we often ignore small pains, brushing them off as nothing, the way Gideon first did. I remember once pushing through a fever for days, convinced it would just go away, only to end up in the ER. But Gideon didn't have a hospital. He didn't even have neighbors close by. Out there, miles from anyone, survival meant silence. You endured or you didn't. But this wasn't something a man could just push through, because those silver fragments weren't random. They were uniform, perfectly shaped, as if manufactured. And that's the part that still chills me. The idea that something so deliberate, so artificial, could be forming inside a living body. What was happening to Gideon Marsh wasn't just an illness. It was the beginning of a secret buried deep in the mountains. A secret that powerful men would kill to keep hidden.
3 months before that morning when his leg finally gave way, Gideon had first noticed the tiniest bump just above his knee. At the time, it was no bigger than a marble. Out on the ranch, bruises were as common as dust, and he figured it came from wrangling cattle or fixing a busted fence post, nothing worth thinking twice about. But the thing about pain is, it has a way of demanding attention. Each day the lump grew, and with it came a deeper, pulsing ache that never let him forget it was there. The skin stretched tight, angry and purple, like it was ready to tear at any moment. Walking became a battle. Every step reminded him that something inside his body was taking root. Now, most of us would have run straight to a doctor. But Gideon? He lived days away from the nearest town. And more than that, he was the kind of man who believed in pushing through. Maybe you know someone like that. Or maybe you've done it yourself. Ignored the warning signs, told yourself, it'll heal. It always does. I'll admit I've done the same. Sometimes out of pride, sometimes out of fear. For Gideon, though, isolation was his reality. There was no one to witness his limp, no one to see him gripping the porch rail when the pain struck hardest. He told himself he could bear it. After all, hadn't he survived war, drought, and back-breaking winters? But this pain wasn't ordinary. It was relentless, almost purposeful, as if something beneath the skin had its own will. And that's what unsettles me most about Gideon's story. The idea that his silence, his toughness, might have been exactly what allowed the unknown inside him to grow unchecked. It makes me wonder, how often do we mistake endurance for strength, when in truth, it's the very thing that puts us in danger? For 3 long months, Gideon carried that secret alone, not yet knowing that what was growing inside him wasn't just a wound. It was the beginning of something far more sinister. When the swelling on Gideon's leg finally split open, it wasn't like anything he'd ever seen in all his years of rough living. What poured out wasn't blood, and it wasn't the infection he half expected. Instead, a thick yellowish fluid seeped down his skin, carrying with it tiny shards of metal, each one glinting in the morning sun like grains of silver. Now, imagine standing there, alone on your ranch, watching pieces of your own body sparkle back at you. How do you even process that? Is it sickness, some kind of curse, or something worse, something man-made? Gideon did what any hardened rancher might do. He kept his head. He fetched an old jar from the house, and with hands that had mended fences and branded cattle, he carefully collected the strange liquid. Inside the glass, he could see them more clearly. The fragments weren't random scraps. They were uniform, almost identical, as if they'd been cut and polished by human hands. That's the detail that stops me cold. Nature doesn't make things that perfect. These weren't jagged bits of bone or infection breaking loose. This was silver, refined silver growing inside a man. I think about how we sometimes dismiss the extraordinary when it's too frightening to face. I've done it myself, looked at something I couldn't explain and told myself, it's nothing, it'll pass. But Gideon couldn't dismiss this. Each shard gleamed too brightly, too deliberately. It was as if his body had become a mine shaft, producing wealth in place of blood. And yet, there's a darker question that lingers here. If this silver was forming so precisely, then why? Who or what set this in motion? As Gideon stared at that jar, unease settled heavy in his chest. The wound wouldn't close, and the strange liquid kept weeping, leaving behind new fragments that seemed almost drawn together, arranging themselves in patterns on the ground. It wasn't just metal escaping his body. It was a message, one he couldn't yet understand, but one that was about to pull him into something far bigger than himself. It was Boone Carter who first saw the truth Gideon had been hiding. Boone wasn't just a neighbor. He was the kind of friend who showed up unannounced, the kind who noticed when your lantern stayed dark too many nights in a row. When he stepped into Gideon's cabin, the smell of metal and sickness hung in the air. And then he saw it, the jar on the table, glimmering with liquid that should never have come from a man's body. I imagine the silence in that room must have been heavy. Gideon, worn down but still stubborn, trying to explain what he himself didn't understand. Boone leaning in, squinting at the silver fragments as if sheer will might make sense of them. They were farmers, ranchers, men of the land. What did they know of metals appearing in flesh? Boone didn't waste time. He sent word, and soon Dr. Silas Ward arrived with his daughter, Clementine. Now, Ward was no ordinary country doctor. He had the air of a man who'd seen things he couldn't quite say out loud. When he examined Gideon's wound, his face tightened, not in confusion, but in recognition. That's what chills me. He knew something. Clementine, younger but sharp-eyed, noticed the uniformity of the silver shards. "These don't belong to the body," she whispered. And that's when the name Silver Peak first surfaced. The old mine where Gideon had labored 15 years earlier. Think about that. A mine abandoned, its wealth stripped away, yet here it was resurfacing inside the flesh of a man who once broke his back in its tunnels. Coincidence? Or was there a link, something buried deeper than rock and ore? I can't shake the thought that Gideon's suffering wasn't just sickness. It was evidence. Evidence of something long hidden, something powerful enough that even a doctor looked uneasy speaking its name. And in that small cabin, with Boone standing guard and Ward exchanging grim glances with his daughter, the battle lines were quietly being drawn. Dr. Ward didn't speak right away. He set the jar back on the table, folded his hands, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire. When he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than any scalpel. "Gideon, you're not the first." That silence broke something in me as I imagined it, because what Ward revealed next wasn't just medical fact. It was a haunting pattern. 17 men, all miners at Silver Peak, had suffered in the same way. Strange swellings, agonizing pain. And then, when their bodies could take no more, each one died, carrying the secret inside them that no one outside the mining camp ever heard about. Until now. 17 lives reduced to whispers. 17 families left only with grief. And the mine? It just kept digging, swallowing men whole as if nothing had happened. Ward explained that the silver itself was tainted. The ore wasn't ordinary. It carried within it some unstable mineral, a contaminant that seeped into the body over time. Imagine that. The very metal they labored to pull from the earth was embedding itself back into their flesh, turning them into living, breathing evidence of the mine's poison. And here's what gnaws at me. If Ward knew this, if men like Gideon were walking proof, why hadn't the world heard sooner? Was it fear? Was it power? Or maybe the mine's silver, polished into coins and jewelry, was worth more than the lives of those who pulled it from the rock. I can't help but think about the cost of silence. Maybe you felt that too, when something isn't right, but those with the power to speak up choose to look away. How many lives get buried because of greed? As Gideon sat there, exhausted but listening, he realized his pain wasn't just personal anymore. His body carried the story of 17 dead men. And in that small cabin, the weight of a mine's hidden crimes finally began to surface. What Gideon learned next was more chilling than the pain in his leg. The mine hadn't just poisoned men by accident. No, it was worse. The company knew. They had watched it happen before, and instead of protecting their workers, they found a way to profit from the very sickness they caused. Dr. Ward explained it in a voice that carried both anger and resignation. When those tumors swelled inside the miners, they weren't just killing them slowly. They were growing silver. Shards of metal, pure and gleaming, embedded in flesh like hidden veins of ore. And the company, they treated these men not as human beings, but as walking mines. The pattern was grotesque. A man would fall sick, unable to work. The company doctors would step in, not to heal, but to harvest. They cut into bodies as though they were rock walls, extracting every ounce of silver before the man drew his last breath. Some miners were silenced outright, their deaths written off as accidents, their remains discarded while the company quietly filled its coffers. Can you imagine that? A place where human life is weighed against metal and metal always wins. It makes you wonder, how often has history buried these kinds of secrets? How many industries built fortunes not on innovation or progress, but on the broken bodies of the forgotten? I'll be honest, hearing this makes me think of the times I've seen people give everything to a job that gave nothing back. Maybe you felt that too, that sense of being used up, like the work takes more from you than it ever gives. But Gideon's story, it's that feeling pushed to its darkest extreme. As the truth settled in, Gideon understood why the company had been so silent about Silver Peak. Those men were never seen as fathers, brothers, or friends. To the company, they were just ore, flesh and bone reduced to profit margins. And sitting there in that dimly lit cabin, Gideon realized something terrifying. His fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing against a machine that had been feeding on men like him for years, hidden behind the shine of silver. The night was quiet when the knock came. Too heavy, too deliberate to belong to a neighbor. Gideon knew before he even opened his eyes that it wasn't a friendly visit. Standing in the doorway were men from the company, dressed sharp, but carrying a menace you could feel in your bones. They didn't bother with sympathy. They didn't ask how he was holding up. Instead, they delivered their demand like it was routine. Gideon had to come with them. They claimed it was for treatment, but the truth slipped through in the way they said it. The silver inside his body, they declared, belonged to the company. Can you imagine hearing that? That the pain burning inside you, the thing threatening your life, wasn't even yours to fight for? That it was corporate property? It's the kind of statement that makes your blood run cold, because you realize you're no longer a person to them. You're an asset, a resource. Dr. Ward didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his voice firm, Clementine beside him with eyes blazing. For the first time in years, someone stood between Gideon and the machine that had consumed so many others. Ward told the men plainly, Gideon wasn't going anywhere, and if they wanted to argue, they could do it in front of the authorities. Because the truth about Silver Peak, about the men who died with silver in their bones, was already on its way to being exposed. The tension in that cabin was suffocating. The company men were used to obedience, to fear, but here they met resistance. For the first time, their threats were matched by something stronger, the courage of people who refused to look away. I think about that moment often, because it feels bigger than just Gideon's fight. How many times in our own lives have we been told to hand something over, our health, our dignity, our worth, because someone with power claimed it was theirs? Most of us don't get a chance to push back. Gideon did, and with Ward and Clementine at his side, he wasn't just protecting himself. He was forcing the world to see the company for what it really was. In the end, the truth could no longer be buried. Boone, Dr. Ward, and Clementine had gathered enough evidence to light a fire no company lawyer or politician could smother. Old medical records, fragments of ore, sworn testimonies from families who had lost their fathers and brothers in the mines, it all painted a picture too dark to ignore. For years, the whispers had been dismissed as superstition, just miners' tales. But now the lies had names, dates, bodies, and the law had no choice but to listen. I imagine what it must have felt like, sitting in that courtroom as the charges were read out loud. Murder, conspiracy, exploitation, words that carried the weight of every man who had gone into Silver Peak and never come back the same. The executives who once spoke with arrogance, who thought they owned the ground and everything pulled from it, suddenly found themselves stripped bare. They weren't pioneers. They weren't builders of progress. They were predators, standing trial for the lives they had consumed. There's something haunting about that reversal. For so long, the miners had no voice. Their suffering was hidden in the dark, like the veins of silver themselves. And yet, when the light finally hit, it was blinding. The company's empire crumbled, not with explosions, not with fire, but with truth and the courage of a few people who refused to stay silent. I think about that a lot. How fragile power really is when it's built on lies, and how much strength it takes for ordinary people to push back. Maybe you felt that in your own way, that moment when someone tried to make you believe your pain didn't matter, that your life could be reduced to numbers on a ledger. But Gideon's story reminds us, even when the odds feel impossible, there's a power in truth and in the voices willing to carry it. And so, the miners of Silver Peak were finally seen. Their deaths no longer hidden, their stories no longer silenced. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived.
Gideon survived. After everything, the pain, the fear, the long nights when even he wondered if his body would betray him, he walked away with nothing more than a thin scar, a mark carved into his skin like a reminder of the battle that nearly cost him everything. To the casual eye, he looked unchanged, but inside, something in him had shifted forever. When he returned to his ranch, to the familiar rhythm of the animals and the quiet breath of the open land, life felt different. The silence wasn't just peace anymore. It was clarity. Each sunrise, each step through the fields carried a weight he hadn't noticed before. Maybe you know that feeling too, the way a brush with death can make ordinary moments feel almost sacred. But Gideon also carried the memory of what he had seen, the greed that had twisted men into monsters, the way a company tried to claim ownership of something as intimate as the marrow in his bones. It's hard to shake the realization that human beings can look at another person and see not a neighbor, not a brother,
but a resource. I can't help but think of our own world today and how often profit gets placed above people. How many times do we read about corporations polluting water or cutting corners with safety and wonder if the story is really so different from Silver Peak? For Gideon, the answer wasn't found in revenge or anger. It was in turning back to what was real. The warmth of an animal brushing against his side, the sound of laughter carried across the wind, the soil beneath his boots steady and honest, unlike the silver that had almost consumed him. That scar on his body, it wasn't just a wound, it was proof. Proof that he had endured and proof that life, even scarred, is worth treasuring. Gideon's story leaves us with a question I keep coming back to. When faced with the cruelty of greed, what do we choose to hold on to? For him, the answer was simple. He chose the small, quiet truths that can never be stolen.
What still haunts me about Gideon's story isn't just the silver or the scars or even the corruption. It's the courage. Because let's be honest, most of us, when pushed into a corner by a force so much bigger than ourselves, we feel powerless. What can one man really do against the company with endless money, lawyers, and influence? Yet Gideon did what so many might not. He refused to be silent. It was his courage, steady and unshaken, that cracked open the truth. Without him, the company's crimes might have stayed buried in the dark, hidden beneath the earth, just like the silver they stole from the miners' bones. And I can't help but wonder how many other stories in history have been lost simply because people were too afraid or too tired to fight back. I think about this often because courage isn't some grand heroic act that belongs only to the few. Sometimes it looks like a man saying no when everyone else says yes. Sometimes it looks like protecting a friend, even when you're scared yourself. Maybe you felt it too, that moment when you know speaking up could cost you something, but staying silent could cost you more. Gideon's stand wasn't just about himself. His choice to resist, to expose the truth, saved lives. It pulled others out of the shadows of exploitation, and it showed something I deeply believe. Injustice only wins when ordinary people surrender. But when ordinary people find the courage to rise, even the most powerful structures can crumble. In the end, Gideon's story isn't just a tale of greed or survival. It's a mirror. It asks us, what would we do if we were in his place? Would we look away, or would we step forward, knowing the risk? Because history isn't shaped by silence. It's shaped by those willing to speak, to fight, to endure. And maybe the greatest mystery here isn't the silver at all. Maybe it's this. Where does courage like that come from? And do we have it in us, too?